Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Grandmaster Plan Podcast, your premier podcast for high-level Gwent strategy, talk, and analysis. Today, I am joined by my two awesome co-hosts, ShoePlays. What's going on, Mr. Shoe?
How's it going, everyone? Good to be here again.
And Truedawn. What's going on, dude?
Oh, nothing. Just in the MTGA waiting room.
This week, man. This week.
Yeah.
Yeah, should be really cool. So we did just, we're coming right off the finish of the big Gwent Open here. So we're going to be talking Gwent Open stuff for today's podcast. There was some interesting deck choices, particularly from the factions, a lot of interesting bans. Where do you guys want to start here? There's a lot to talk about.
Go ahead.
There's a lot to talk about. Obviously, congratulations to Hannah-chan,
Yes.
the winner of this Open. It's about time. He's really, really strong player. It's cool to see him now have some success. He brought like a pretty cool lineup. It looked like that's the cookie cutter one. Pretty much was Henselt, Alchemy, Skellige of some variety, and Deathwish. That's the level 1 lineup, and that's what Hannah-chan brought. So it's tuned it well. Did reasonably well, and we actually saw a lot of Triss Telekinesis across a lot of the lineups.
Great card.
It did, right?
Yeah.
That's a card that's been working its way into multiple different archetypes. It's sort of very similar to how John Natalis functions in the various Henselt lists. We're seeing it in Alchemy, and the most interesting to me is that we're seeing it in Skellige as well. What are your guys' thoughts on this card? It's been performing great.
Yeah, when it initially first came out, my opinion of it was whenever you have a deck that really wants to see a particular spell more often, you're going to probably play Triss in that deck. And my initial impulse was Winch in Henselt, and that I think it's good in that as well. But even in Skellige, as we've seen, if you want to use it with Reconnaissance or use it with the Skull Talisman, Bone Talisman, that thing, just have more reses, and especially how Tailbot used it, where you were playing it alongside Saris, so that like having a very high density of reses does matter. That's another spot where it's very, very strong. We also saw Hannah-chan put it in his Alchemy deck just to get more access to ointments or Mahakamail. Seems totally reasonable. So whenever you have a deck where the spells are things you just want to see a lot of, and there really isn't much diminishing return, you're going to probably want to play Triss.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you brought up Hannah-chan's deck list. I also think, in part, we're seeing another new card in here, by the way, in Dandelion Poet, and it looks like Hannah-chan, with his Alchemy list, preferred. We saw a split on the different Alchemy decks, basically, in the tournament. He went the route of, I'm scared of opposing Mandrakes, so I'm not going to include Kahir, and I'm going to go with the Triss and Dandelion package, just for more consistency and more raw points. So what do you guys think about that?
I think the Alchemy list kind of in general have really kind of gotten stepped up a notch from last patch just because of Triss. For exactly what you said, Joe, like Mandrake is super common, people trying to counter Alchemy and among other decks, and you can kind of use Triss to kind of like replace Kahir as like your late game finisher. You get 6 right off the bat, you can chain into ointments, into like slave drivers, into novices, things like that for really big plays. And I think at the top of the meta, she's really kind of replaced Kahir in a lot of people's Alchemy's decks, or at least made it so that it's not as common and it's a little bit harder to counter that exact strategy. I think like Truedawn, Triss, when she was first revealed, I was like, yeah, she'd be good in Henselt, some spell type decks, but I really wasn't expecting her to kind of slot into Alchemy so well, and even like these Skellige lists as well as she did and as common as she is. But I think it's she's a really cool card. I mean, she's create done right, so I'm not really minding her too much.
Now, as someone who has not played with the card that much, is the pool like, so if I have Mahakamail and Poultice in my deck, when I play Triss, do I just see one Mahakam, one Poultice, or does it pull from the full 6?
It's only
that's my experience. You only see one. It's not like Sleep Driver.
Okay. Because that's actually like relevant, because if we get into a metagame where everyone's playing Triss and they have their spells they want to hit, the opponent's spells start to dilute your spell pool. But if it's like it only occupies one Discover slot per spell, then it's going to require a lot for it to disrupt you. So you're probably fine.
Yeah, it's definitely a powerful card. That distinction, it being different than Slave Driver in that way, certainly helps add to its power level. And I'm sort of with you guys in that I expected this to be a tournament, playable card. In particular decks, and I didn't expect to have this type of impact, though. It really seems that just throwing a 6-point body onto a spell you were going to play already, it's just like a proven formula that works here. I mean, we're seeing Vesemir, we're seeing Tribute, I believe it's Wispus. I always get Wispus and Gross. Yeah, Wispus Tribute. We see John Natalis has sort of been a staple in the various Northern Realms decks for quite some time. This whole 6-point body with the spell you were playing anyway just seems to be, a nice benchmark for tournament caliber cards.
I don't even think it's so much the body. I think it's more the utility you get. So, for an example, in Henselt, it's an extra winch, and that goes a long way in, making your Henselt more consistent, that you can get the cards you want off that, make bigger plays with the Henselt. And even with Alchemy, I don't really think it's so much about, 6 points on an ointment being so good, because that's decent for a gold, but could be better. I think it's more the fact that you kind of replace it as your kind of Kahir card, where you're like chaining different things going on, and you're less vulnerable to Mandrake. And even with Skellige, like, I don't think Triss into Recon is really what Skellige, would like to be doing. That's not really like their, top of the food chain kind of play. They're just more doing it, I think, because Skellige doesn't really have that great golds that, are synergizing with a veteran strategy or like a bear strategy.
Yeah, like, I encountered that problem with a lot of Skellige decks I've been playing at the beginning of the format. I tried Dandelion Poet, and that was good. Like, Dandelion Poet's not bad. But I think that I would prefer to build it in somewhat, like, similar to how Tailbot did, where you have Triss alongside Bone Talisman with, like, Saris instead of Wolfsbane, as much as I love Wolfsbane. Actually, I want to play Wolfsbane over Saris. But anyway, if you're playing Saris, the extra res becomes, like, very relevant.
Yeah, so, yeah, definitely.
Like, that's a big part of it. So, like, whenever you're able to just, like, free roll some points on stuff you play anyway, you're going to be in a good spot. And that's, like, we see a lot more golds being designed in that fashion, where they're just, like, 5 or 6 points pull a thing from your deck. Which you could debate the interest of, but it's what we got, so.
I was pretty interested that, usually when you see these Chinese players, not just in Gwent or card games, but really in all games, they, kind of live in their own little community, competitive community.
Yeah,
and
the
you
meta's
see them,
very different, right?
Yeah, you see them doing a lot of different odd things. It's almost like a bubble that they live in, which kind of forms a little unique, different play style or card choices that you see compared to like other regions. And I don't think we saw too much of that this time from Hanachan. Like, the last big tournament he was in, he was bringing like alchemy and things like that, and I believe he was like on Mill way back in the day when Mill wasn't super common. But this tournament, he just, like Truedawn was saying, it was the standard stuff. He just picked the best decks, and it worked out well for him.
Yeah, I think one of the most unique choices we actually saw here, and I definitely like to talk about it for a little while. Fellow Topdecker Koloman, he unfortunately was knocked out of the tournament in the semifinal round, but he decided to bring the Consume deck, which is super polarizing, can easily be beaten if people are prepared for it, as he knows better than anyone after the drubbing he took by Super JJ in the last Open event. And not only did the Consume deck just have this incredibly high upside of, performing well and being a great deck, it was eating some of the bans from players, which sort of let him get his Henselt through the banning process. What do you guys think about the bringing Consume strategy? Not a lot of players employed it.
It's definitely a really interesting dynamic because, like you said, it really taxes your opponent's bans, because most people would go into that thinking, well, I'm going to have to probably ban Henselt and then build their lineup according, and then maybe they have a weak spot against Consume, and then when they see Coleman's lineup, they're like, okay, I'm not great against either of these decks, and that's like a really good spot for Coleman to be in. From what I didn't get to see his series, but apparently like he didn't draw Neckers in a couple games, and that was not great for him. But it seemed like a really good decision to bring Consume, because people weren't really that prepared for it. Like, everyone's running Mandrake, but that's one answer. You need way more than that in most cases. So I thought it was a great strategy. I would have liked to see it work out a little bit better, but it definitely, there's a lot of equity in bringing a lineup other than what people are expecting, because of how tightly tuned lineups usually are against what people perceive to be the things they're going to.
Yeah, I think he got a lot of value out of that. And to the point you were talking about as well, Mandrake only stops one of the Neckers. And this list in particular, it's actually running Summoning Circle, which is sort of your fourth Necker, if you will, as it's good against Muzzle and it's good against Mandrake. The only real anti-Necker tech that it doesn't do much against is of course Coral, because you'll wind up Summoning Circling the Jade figurine.
For reasons, because...
Because what do you think about the whole consume strategy, Shoe, particularly with like the Summoning Circle and his whole little deck list going on here?
Yeah, I liked it in theory. Like, it's a cool idea where, you know, in the meta right now, there's not a ton of decks that just hard counter consume, or it's not even really that common on ladder, things like that, where it's in people's minds. And I think we saw that a lot. Like, no one really had a deck that was, you know, multiple answers to these Neckers and things like that. There are a few archetypes that can like really nag that deck, like Henselt and Alchemy in particular. They have some damage stuff. You can remove some Neckers early and kind of put them into weird situations. If your hand is pretty good, you can maybe bleed them out. So it wasn't like, you know, too great, but I did like the choice overall. Like, it's interesting kind of just soaking up one of those bands when, you know, a lot of people are looking for, you know, Alchemy or Henselt, and just that, you get a ton of mileage out of that, really, because in this meta, there's no, like, one deck that you have to ban, like Dwarves or anything like that, so there's a lot of flexibility in that, and by just running Consume, you kind of throw a wrench into a lot of people's plans.
Yeah, and segueing right from that, we saw that Henselt was by far the most banned out deck of this tournament. Now, this is probably for several reasons. Henselt's just a very generically powerful strategy. It's super consistent at executing its game plan, and particularly in a tournament like this, where red coin, blue coin is controlled, the fact that you could always have your Henselt on a red coin, I think, is the large. It's sort of the factor that pushes it over the edge and why people were forced to ban Henselt. Do you guys agree, disagree? What are your thoughts on the mass Henselt banning this tournament?
It's definitely one of the decks that capitalizes on red coin the best. Brouver Hoog does as well, with
Yes.
about the same level of efficacy. It's interesting because Henselt originally was so good on red coin because you could have that initial tempo swing, like you would try to do your Henselt early, and like they had no good play, they couldn't catch up, so they'd have to pass or whatever. But now we actually see it being used as like a finisher a high percentage of the time, which like is very good still, but that doesn't really have much bearing on how good you are on or off the red coin. So I think that on some level there is a perception of Henselt being much better on the red coin than it is, just because of how people play it. Granted, they could change how they play it and like shove like harder earlier to like leverage the coin if they wanted to, but in a lot of games I've watched of Henselt, they're not playing it in such a way to really like punish people too hard for being on the blue coin.
I don't even think it's maybe Henselt itself that's necessarily super good on the red coin. I mean, obviously the tempo of him is kind of insane, but you know, with some smart passing, you can kind of play around that pretty well. I think it's more the light calves that really, you know, make Henselt so good on the red coin, and especially when you can shuffle those back in with Nenica. Like, if you're going second in rounds 1 and 3, you know, you get your light calves out round 1, you shuffle them back in with Nenica, get them back out round 3. Like, that's really tough to deal with. I mean, you just take a you know, a huge play like maybe Alchemy here, something that's maybe like 20-30 points, and you just kind of like cut that in half. It's like pretty insane right there. And
Are you saying that 6 free roaches are good? That's
Yeah, Dumb Banner is very problematic in how it interacts with Thaler. Although, if you have the spy to counter their Thaler, you can play around it. You can manage the gap, and then from that, once your spy checks their spy, the game kind of plays out in a healthy fashion where like Dumb Banner is supposed to operate, where you're like both trying to tiptoe around like enabling it, like they're trying to slow roll, you're trying to also slow roll so you enable it. Like, that's like reasonably interesting gameplay. But yes, it's incredibly strong, and one of the bigger reasons why that deck is so good on the red coin in conjunction with Thaler. So
yeah,
yeah,
we were sorry, Joe. We were talking before about how it makes for really interesting games, the Dun Banner, because it's kind of like this tension of, you know, you want to be ahead but not too far ahead. And I think one of the coolest games we saw that was Coleman against Tailbot. in the semis, and it really showed just like how in tune Tailbot was with this whole matchup. Where he passed round 1 in a situation where it wasn't too bad for him. He wasn't too behind on cards, and kind of blocked those done banners. And he also kind of forced Coleman into a pass because he was up one card going into round 2. So Coleman had to do that dry pass to get the card back without the Thaler. And then round 3, like, only having that done banner was fine because Tailbot had all his powerful plays still in hand. And, like, that was a really cool game, seeing just kind of that push and pull with the done banners. And, Tailbot making that good pass round 1, I think, where he set himself up to win that game against Henselt on the red coin, which is not easy to do.
No, it's really not.
The vast majority of skill in Gwent right now is understanding when to pass in what matchup and like how much you want to commit to a given round. Like that's like 90% of it right now is just understanding when you're supposed to pass on the red coin or the blue coin or whatever, and what matchups you can afford to play a long round, etc. And we saw Tailbot do that exceptionally well. We saw Hanachan do that exceptionally well. That's where a lot of the players get to really showcase their knowledge of the format and matchups, is just making the matchup play out on their terms through knowing when to.
I couldn't agree with that statement more. When I was making my little climb towards Grandmaster this season, which we finally got there on Friday, the large portion of the matches I was getting a significant edge in was passing properly and watching opponents make improper passes. I think that's really well put, and I think that's a large chunk of where the better players are getting their edge right now.
Yeah, and you saw with Tailbot. I mean, he didn't play perfectly by any means at all. Like
No
tons
one
of
did.
really bad
There
plays from
was-
him.
Yeah.
But because he was on point with his passing, like, he put himself in a situation where he could throw away like 10 or 12 value and still win the game because he was already so far ahead from like really smart passes in prior rounds.
Yeah, what you see from these top level players is everyone makes play mistakes, right? Like the best players in the world are going to make mistakes. It's going to happen all the time. I think this is a big common misperception that the best players don't make mistakes. But what you don't often see them make mistakes in is their overarching strategy and their plan. Their plan and their strategy is always very, very tight, and they understand exactly their vision for how they're going to win the game and trying to steer the game into a position where they can execute that plan. You do, see the play mistakes here and there in the execution of this and the little technical plays, I guess you would call them. But from an overarching strategic standpoint, you're watching some of the best players in the world try to steer these games in the direction that's going to lead them to win.
One of the first things you learn in or at least what that I learned when I started playing Magic is you need to ask yourself what needs to happen for me to win this game. What does me winning this game look like? And then subsequently, what can I do to get to that reality? What decisions can I make that lead towards that being a thing? And understanding how to pass in a given matchup is like pretty much that whole equation in Gwent. Because all the cards are so analogous in Gwent. They're all worth roughly the same thing. The only places you're getting edges are when you are able to get a card. And the best way to get a card is by leveraging and then reinforcing it with either a spy or carryover or whatever. So whenever you were able to go a card up, or at least threaten to go a card up, that's like going to be what the game's about. And it's the main spot to leverage win equity, because all the other decisions, they matter, but they're usually like 1 or 2 points and stuff. And a whole card is just like way, way more.
Yeah, you'd have to add up so many of these like small 1 point, 2 point, 3 point edges to equal the impact of one of these cards, right?
Yeah.
And it's often with these high level games like razor close, players aren't really misplaying in a huge way. Maybe they're missing out on a little bit of value here and there, but not enough where you really get these kind of super obvious passes like, oh, he's down 3 cards, like, let's just pass. It's things where you have to make very tight decisions where, you're hand reading a little bit. Maybe if he has this card, he can get ahead of me in one. Maybe you're adding up different things like weather procs and maybe like Archospores jumping. So it's often very close, like the line between passing and not passing, and it's not always easy, like, certainly. And that's kind of what separate a lot of these really good players in the tournament here is they're often on point with the passing.
One of the other interesting things about passing that we're talking about, obviously you have this game plan like we were talking about, and you want to steer the game in a direction after you visualize what it's going to look like when you're going to win. But you do have to be sort of flexible with this because a lot of the passing decision also plays upon what resources your opponent still has left in their deck. And if you know that, okay, they haven't played their big finisher yet, or what golds have they played, and you have a pretty good understanding of the cards that are commonly played in that archetype, what they have and haven't played can often influence your decision and have to cause you to sort of do a 180 and change your plan mid-round. So I think that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've kind of noticed too in these high level games is that round two is a lot more played out than, on ladder when I'm playing. Just, I think these players kind of realize that there are opportunities to gain advantages in round two besides just open passing. So you'll see them play into it a lot more than I think normally. What do you guys think about that?
Well, that plays into the understanding of matchups. So when you understand who has inevitability in a round, who favors like a long round, or who like may have had like a sketchy mulligan because their deck is greedy or whatever, like all of those factors play into whether or not you want to push someone in round two, and play into how much you value winning over losing for value. So that's like stuff that the more experienced pro players are going to understand, and that's why you see that more in those games rather than normal games, because most people like aren't going to really like do the work or understand like, okay, they're like, because they have this card and I have this card that is slightly better, I should try and play a long round or whatever, or I can try and shove them and get their gold cards out or something like that. You can formulate a game plan at that high level to make it so playing out round two actually becomes profitable when you have the knowledge of what your opponent is doing.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that these top level players, like you're saying, other players aren't going to go in and do the work, right? And the easy solution a lot of times would be to dry pass after winning, like, hey, I've gotten my card back, whatever. But if you've run the numbers, you've done the work, you've played thousands upon thousands of games, and you understand that, okay, this is what my opponent is willing to commit in this round, this is what I'm willing to commit in this round, I can get myself in a position where I'm like 95% to, get my card back because of these factors, and I can potentially get some really solid resources out of my opponent. It then can become very, very profitable to play into round two. So I do think it's a play skill thing here.
Another thing that I found kind of interesting was the deck choices that were brought. So there was a good amount of variety in terms of no deck really being like tier one top of the mountain. Like there's no like dwarves that just everyone knows is super good. Like you either have to ban it or tech against it in some way. I thought a lot of the top decks were pretty similar in skill level. Alchemy, Northern Realms, Dagon, Deathwish, things like that. But there wasn't a lot of variety within the actual builds of the decks outside of Skellige. What do you
Yep.
guys think about that, as Skellige being kind of the most varied in here, and other decks kind of being a little bit similar?
So I thought it was super cool. We saw a lot of different Skellige archetypes, noticeably no Axman, which is something I also want to touch on. My initial impression was that, okay, say there's a bunch of different Skellige decks. There was an entirely different theme deck. We saw great swords. We saw sort of almost a last patch kind of version that's just looking to abuse the light longships and the Berserker Marauders. One of the more interesting things too, King Bran sort of made his big return here. And I could be wrong here. My initial impression of this was that people came into the tournament thinking they were going to ban Henselt, which meant that they were going to be leaving up Alchemy. And I think they fairly expected pretty much everyone to bring an Alchemy deck, which meant that in this environment, even though Great Swords is probably the better deck in a vacuum, it being weak to the Alchemy matchup that they knew they were going to leave unchecked led them to go with the more traditional style of old King Bran deck list. That was my impression of it.
Yeah, I mean, Brand's just the better leader by a lot, also. But
That's
yeah,
also true.
yeah, it's. I'm kind of shocked it took people this long to figure it out, but we're here now. Everything's okay.
Finally, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it's if you are expecting to run into Alchemy a lot, that deck has like infinite removal. Great Swords is weaker to that than the other Skellige archetypes. If you want to insulate yourself from that, it makes sense to play something else. Although worth noting, Hannah Chan won the tournament with the Great Sword.
Certainly did.
So the deck, it's like the deck's not ice cold to remove. you can definitely have game against it. You can also get your Skellige win against not alchemy. Like you can kind of deploy your decks in such a fashion where you can think, okay, they're not going to play alchemy this round. I'll try and get my win with Skellige or something like that. Like you don't always need to beat alchemy. So there's a lot of ways you can go about it where if you think it's good enough, you can leverage that and still play.
I know you're also super high on King Bran as a leader, as am I. I think he's one of, if not the most powerful leader in the game. How do you feel about something like King Bran in the tournament setting where there's the red coin, blue coin, so that you can sort of use the guaranteed access to carryover to leverage, potential blue coin matchup and get out of the round in better shape? Do you think that played into it also?
Yeah, I mean that's actually one of the reasons why I love Wolfsbane and usually play it over Saris, because Wolfsbane gives you a lot of play around in the first few turns about whether or not you want playing or get out of the round profitably. So you could like play Bran, establish your carryover, and have Wolfsbane ticking. And if they like do some big swing or something, you just get out of the round. Your Wolfsbane ticks at the beginning of the next round, and you like play Udalric into it or something, and you're like in super good shape. Or you can just, if you want to keep playing the round, you keep playing the round. Your Wolfsbane goes. It was interesting that we didn't really see any Wolfsbane. It was like all Saris. And granted, people had like plans for that. And Saris is still very strong. She's very strong in a short round 3. She makes it so you're always going to have the most carryover because like plus old, no one's that. So there is equity in Saris, and that's what a lot of people decided to go with. But I think that the choice between her and Wolfsbane is interesting, and I'm generally on the side of Wolfsbane.
I think a lot of people were kind of in the boat where they only wanted enough carryover that they can block that dry pass, because, with a lot of prior patches in the game removing a lot of carryover, like the dry pass is super important for getting cards back. And if you have just enough carryover to block that, then like that's great for you. I think we did see a good amount of crack. I think the reason for that, like even though Bran is stronger, I think just in certain decks, I think that crack is stronger in other certain decks. So for example, like Great Swords and Veteran, I think crack just works better with those particular decks, even though I think Bran is like overall stronger. So I think that's why we saw a good balance between that, as people were running Bran in the decks where it would work. And then, if you want to run like a Veterans or Great Sword, you were slotting in crack to make that particular deck stronger.
Yes.
One thing I really like was the Shieldsmith with longbows. I think that is kind of the card that has been under the radar for a little bit, but that on like your carryover units, that on like putting that in front of your longboats, I think that was really good. You get like 15 value out of that. You can get some carryover out of that, strengthen your units. Like that's a cool card that I've seen kind of go under the radar, and I'm glad it got its moment in the spotlight.
It was definitely like a lot of the Skellige builds, like the last 3 bronzes are a big question mark. And Armorsmith was one of the ones I tried out, and it was reasonable. And that's like Cole Moen's deck, for instance, is one of the ones that utilize that. Shouts to Coleman. Is it Coleman or Colmoen? Do we ever figure this out?
I think it's Colmoen. I think I just say it wrong.
100% spelled Colmoen,
Yes.
but they were saying Coleman.
I think it's Khalid Moeen.
Yeah.
Got there.
So
boys.
I'm gonna go with Colmoen. But Colmoen played Wolfsbane, played the blacksmiths and stuff, and obviously like alongside the long ships, you can, for example, like play a long ship, play armorsmith next to it, pump the long ship, and then the subsequent armorsmiths get like the first one into red health, and then you can pump it and then have the armor, so you still have red health for your berserkers, but it's not taking damage anymore, stuff like that. So there is a lot of ways that card synergizes well with both berserker and longship. So that deck seemed really cool, and I think that armorsmith or blacksmith rather is going to probably be one of the bronzes you see playing Skellige. There's like a bunch of equatable ones, and he's one of them.
Yeah, it's I think the other side to that card is also that it actually plays into the Saris versus Wolfsbane debate. Something that you had said earlier, that you're much more of a fan of Wolfsbane. Not this patch because Dagon's good, so I'm playing that. But I've played a bunch of Skellige decks in the past with both of the cards, and I found Wolfsbane to be the better card in every single matchup except for the mirror, where the guy who had the Saris was just at a huge advantage. And the Shieldsmith is also an interesting card in that you can use it to effectively get one more point of carryover than your opponent when you're putting it on an Olgierd, a Morkvarg, things like that. So it can also sort of play into the carryover war, which is sort of what the Skellige mirror comes down to a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because like when you're playing Wolfsbane and they're playing Ceres, they're always gonna have superior carryover on you, but their opener is worse, so you can usually leverage the tempo from Wolfsbane to like punish them for that. Sometimes you can't. It depends on whether you have Ulderic and they don't, like anything. But that there is like interplay going on there. So like they get superior carryover, you have to leverage your thing. But yeah, it's like an interesting debate between the two. And the synergy between Ceres and Armorsmith is definitely relevant if you like pump Ceres. It's neat.
I also wanted to touch on one of the things that ShoePlay actually mentioned, and he was talking about how Crack is better for the Greatsword decks than Bran, obviously. And an interesting thought that occurred to me when he said that was Crack is almost sort of playing the role of Bran in that deck because it's a guaranteed tutor, right? Like Crack wouldn't be better except for the fact that it's just guaranteed putting the Greatsword into play, and the deck largely doesn't function without that. So you're sort of using it for the same, almost like a Brouver Hoog type of effect to just guarantee access to a card, which is a lot of what Bran does for you as a leader. When you see Crack in Arena, for example, it's just a big dumb tempo play, right? You're just throwing down a bunch of points. But using it in the Greatsword deck, obviously you have to build the deck in a way that that's true, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, it's the same thing with the veterans too. Like you want to get those round one, you just make it the highest cost card in your deck, and boom, you got it guaranteed. And that's why we see those decks run like Battle Maidens and things like that, ADC to pull these cards out. Just increasing the consistency, which is huge for these decks.
And that's an interesting dynamic for the tournament format because veterans in particular is with Croc is a deck that I think is very strong on red, and it could never win in a million years. So if you are able to like only play it in spots where you know you're on the red coin, that deck becomes a lot better. So like we saw a lot of people doing that in this tournament because you just don't have carryover, and that sucks a whole bunch. You also can't run the spy because that disrupts your veteran tutoring. So you just have no way to flip the coin. But if you're on red coin, you don't need to. So you could just like blow people out of the round. So that was an interesting strategy in a deck that definitely gains a lot in the tournament setting.
So I want to add.
Sorry, it must have to touch on that point. It must have been so damn hard to pick a deck that you want to play on the red coin, because you only have at most 3 chances on the red coin, right? And fucking like every deck in this game is just killer on red. You've got Brouver Hoog, the coin flip abuse deck. You've got Henselt. You want to play that on red. Alchemy, well, it's good on red, but you really don't want to play that thing on blue. It sucks there. Then you have like Crack, which is good on red. Like, how do you choose which deck you're playing on red when every deck wants to play on red?
I think it's a numbers game, right? I'd imagine that players that are playing at this level probably have some detailed statistical workups of, their records on red coin and their records on blue coin in various matches. And if I was preparing for a tournament like this, that's exactly what I would do. I would have my information logged in the spreadsheet. I would have others gathering information for me, and I would see that, okay, let's assuming, Henselt's banned or whatever, this, Alchemy gets a 25% boost in my win rate when I'm playing on the red coin, whereas my Skellige deck gets a 33% boost in win rate while playing on the red coin. And I would approach it mathematically like that. That's the way I do it.
Yeah, I definitely want like probably 2 decks that are good on blue, which is why I'd play Bran, because Bran is great on blue. And I think the reason why a lot of people did Bran, because he's one of the few leaders that is. I actually don't know a second. What's another leader that's good on blue?
Bran wearing a Halloween costume? I don't know.
Yeah,
okay, Arrakis Queen's definitely fair there, right? Because if it gets to execute its plan, it's probably just going to crush you one way or the other.
Even Dagon, I would say, is probably not terrible on blue. It's probably okay.
I think we figured out how Comolin came to his lineup. Just because the Bran, Skellige, the consumer good on blue, and then you have like Nilfgaard and Northern Realms decks. So yeah, I probably would have done that.
Dagon's like all right on blue, just because it feels very all right basically everywhere. But obviously, the red coin is the red coin. While we're talking about Dagon, this is something that I certainly noticed. There was a lot of the list looked very, very similar, all of the different Dagon Deathwish decks that we saw. And one of the interesting prevailing things that was different than the Dagon Deathwish list that I've been using for the last couple of seasons is that Woodland Spirit sort of made its big comeback this tournament. And I believe one of the competitors, I forget which one off the top of my head, was even running a triple Foglet list. So what do you guys think? Why did Woodland Spirit come back, in force into all of these Dagon lists?
It's just the best source of inevitability in a monster. Like, that matters a lot because that deck doesn't really have super good long round outside of that. I mean, you have Arcaspore, which is fine, but you really want something better than that. And I think that a lot of people really wanted access to the fogs from both Dagon and Woodland Spirit. So just having inevitability gives you a lot of leeway in how you can play rounds out. When you have respectable inevitability, you're not just like dead in the water and long scrap it out. So you don't want to play a Deathwish build that's just ice cold to a long round, and Dagon's the best way to counteract that.
Yeah, I think one thing too that was a pretty big factor in a lot of these games was weather. A lot of lists are not really running weather clear at all. Like Alchemy, you're never running that. I mean, you've got the Runestone, so that's kind of like a weather clear guarantee.
And Black Blood into a buy-in.
Of course the Runestone's weather clear. What are you talking about? The Runestone's weather clear 100% of the time.
Even like even Henselt lists, like a lot of them are kind of not really running Death Mold. You want Nenica instead. Even like Dagon Deathwish, like they can't clear weather either. You know, they're playing it themselves, but they're not clearing either. So I think having that extra weather source is really good because you can like bleed people super hard with that. Like Truedawn was talking about the inevitability, you know, along with the Arcaspore. And Woodland Spirit's just a good, you know, kind of tempo way to do that. It was pretty interesting. We did see a lot of Siri Nova Deathwish, which I'm kind of interested in because that was really the hot thing was Nova, and now people are kind of moving to more of a Joe Snow type list where you're just running straight up Deathwish, man. How do you feel being the pioneer?
I think that people just caught on to what I caught on to maybe a little bit earlier than some others. That the Nova deck forced you to play bad cards in your deck in general. Like, I do not think that Rot Fiend is good at all. It's excusable if you have She-Troll, and it's just awful outside of that. And that the core cards of the Deathwish, the core bronzes actually, are so much better than the other options that you really just want to min-max on these type of effects. The Larry the Arcaspore, the Dows, and the Griffins in particular are just very, very powerful. And I want more consistent access to this, and I want more of them than my opponent. There are, like, particularly with Mandrake running around, only running 2 Dows is very, very risky. In a mirror match, if you have 2 Larrys and I have 3 Larrys, I'm going to be at a huge advantage here, which is why I also like the Muzzle and the Caretaker packages, just because it does give me the inevitability that Truedawn was talking about in the longer round. So I don't think that Siri Nova is where I want to be in Deathwish. My thoughts on that haven't changed. This season, I've actually just been running the same exact card-for-card list I used to finish, like, top 32 or top 33 worldwide last season, and I just ran that all the way back to Grandmaster, minus the 10 games of Henselt I played when Shue was gracious enough to hop on my stream with me.
Yeah, maybe it's just a factor too of, like, you know, these all decks out there have super good finishers. Like Henselt's got Baron, Alchemy's got Calvi or like Triss or something like that. So instead of maybe trying to beat people at their own game, I just kind of, you know, throw in the extra weather, throw in the extra, you know, long round good cards like the Griffins and with the Dows, and just maybe take it that way instead.
No, that's like a really good point, because like the whole reason you assume the cost of playing Siri Nova in your deck is supposed to give this like really powerful finisher, like supposed like the best finish, and that's not actually really the case right now. Like a lot of the Skellige things, like Sigdrifa and Iskall and 2 Berserkers about a Siri Nova, the renew on the ship guy is about a Siri Nova. There's like so many things that are like about a Siri Nova, and like most of them aren't even gold, that like you're taking on all of this cost to play a card that like isn't even that good. So yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to erode the consistency of a deck that is really reliant on its synergy to do that. Also, like the Slizzards in the Nova deck are awful. They're the worst.
Yeah, they're really, really
they're
bad
really
in Nova
bad.
deck.
Yeah, it's horrible. So yeah, I'm definitely here for not playing Siri Nova.
Yeah, I mean, and just like you're saying, like Kahir is a Siri Nova and a half. There are so many powerful finishers, and in particular, now I saw not every one of the list at this tournament was running the tribute with Mandrake and Monster Nest package that I've become very, very fond of. But the large majority of the time, if you don't wind up needing your Mandrake, you do have tribute Monster Nest Ghoul Eat a Spy for a 24-point finisher, which is just like another huge built-in play you have in this deck that actually gives it some amount of short game as well.
Yeah. It doesn't, you're not like really, Siri Nova is like about an average finisher, and she's supposed to be better than that. So, and she's not.
So one last thing I wanted to touch on is, what do you guys think about the Brouver Hoog decks that were brought? I think by the semifinals, all but one person who had brought the Brouver Hoog were eliminated. And you know, it seemed like a pretty decent choice, but it didn't really seem like that kind of killer deck that people, you know, say it is, just abusing the coin flip.
Well, one thing I'm interested in, did like the people playing Brouver Hoog get their wins with Brouver and then get dumpstered like their other decks couldn't win, or did their Brouver lose like a bunch? Because that would be relevant. Because Brouver is like objectively nonsense. Like the whole interaction with always seeing your Yavin, having a big tempo swing to offset it, having carryover with War Dancers, having an absurd long round with the buff all your elves guy with Saskia and all that. Like, I think that deck is absurd. It's just, it's one of like the biggest points in favor of removing Silver Spies from the game is that deck. So.
Yeah, like that. I don't know. I also think the Brouver deck is very, very good. And the thing about it, when it wins, its wins feel basically free because of, you know, red coin, Brouver, Spy, I'm up 2 cards. Like the wins are basically just free there. You're not really working for it. I don't know. It's sort of hard to verbalize what I'm trying to think about. I guess the deck does lose some value in the fact that you're playing against such skillful competition that they're sort of able to realize exactly the points to pass to make the round 3 awkward, because the weakness of that deck is its short game, right? It just does not really have a short game. We even saw one of the Brouver Hoog lists playing a Siri Nova version just to try and negate this exact factor. But when you're playing against some of the best players in the world, they can force you into some awkward situations, but on paper, the deck is just damn strong, and particularly on red coin.
See, I'm kind of in the opposite camp. Like, I honestly don't even think the Brouver is that good. Like, outside of its, you know, coin flip shenanigans and winning, being able to win a long round, like, there's not a whole lot much there going for it. Like, you can kind of block, like, dry pass and things like that, but that's not always super relevant. And if you can force that Brouver deck into like a short round 3, or even just like 2 short rounds, you know, maybe if you kind of bleed them the first round and then kind of lose that round and they play 2 short rounds, like you guys are saying, like every deck has a huge finisher, and like even if you're running a Siri Nova in this list, like A, you have to draw it, and then B, like it's not even that good. Like a lot of other finishers and decks just straight up beat it, and I think that's really the big weakness of this deck, and I think that's why it's maybe not as good as people think it may be. And you even have decks like Dagon, which you can just, you know, go toe-to-toe with them in a long round, bleed them out, and then, you know, even if you lose that first round and you're down a card or 2, like your short round is just way, way better than them.
So I agree with you on the point that you were saying that, like, other than the coin flip shenanigans and the Yavin, the deck doesn't have a lot going for it. Obviously, the Great Long Round, and also Alern's just a very powerful thing to have access to. But why my opinion differs from yours is I think I put so much emphasis on how much that one thing they have going for it impacts the game. Like the guaranteed Spy with the huge tempo play to offset it and just completely abusing the coin toss like that, I think has so much value that it can single-handedly carry the archetype, even with some other weaknesses that it has. So I think that's sort of why our opinions differ. I think I'm putting more emphasis on that than you.
I mean, you could definitely like play around. Like I dumpster that deck all the time with Bran when I'm on coin, because you just open with Bran, they play Spy, you pass, and then like Wolfsbane ticks and awful things happen to them. It's great. But like if you do need to have a game plan, and your game plans revolve around how do I beat them playing Spy into Cleaver. And if you can do that, then you'll be good. But you need to that's your whole game plan. You need to do that. So
Yeah, as long as you could get over that initial hump of, the Spy into Cleaver, I think you're fine. Because even a lot of decks have ways to deal with the long round, like Henselt machines are just killing elves, and their long round isn't that good anymore. You know what I mean? So it feels like the deck has a lot of holes to me. Was just curious about your guys' thoughts on it.
yeah, I'm interested to actually see the numbers on was it actually
Same.
losing or did they get wins and just their other decks suck or something?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. So yeah, I think that's most of the open. Joe, you wanted to cover Axman real quick, or the lack of, rather.
I was super curious. As you guys know, a couple of weeks ago we had Trinet on here, and Trinet was, of course, the winner of the Wild Hunt 1 tournament. And he was just sort of singing the praises of how great Axman is and why he believes it's the best deck in the game by a particularly wide margin. And although I didn't necessarily agree with everything he said, he definitely said a lot of things that made me think, and he definitely has a point with some of the things he's saying. I'm checking the leaderboard here. I mean, Trinet is, he's reached Grandmaster again this season. He's slightly above me on the old leaderboard here. And I imagine he used Axman to hit it. I'm curious why there was no Axman represented at all in this tournament.
Yeah, it's weird. I think that Axman is probably the best deck in the game because it's not really weak to anything. You would think ostensibly that it's weak to removal and weather clear, but people don't usually run both of those, and you need to run both. One isn't good. Axman can beat weather clear, and it can beat removal if you don't deal with the other one. You have to deal with both, and just there really aren't decks that are equipped to deal with both. It also has a solid short round with Renew. It's almost always, if you play it right, goes into round 3 up a card. So you're just inherently favored.
You
even
meant
if
Restore, right? Not Renew, or did I miss something?
I call them the other one.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Just yeah, it's the same card to me. Whatever. But yeah, that deck just has game against everything. It's the ceiling of the format. No deck has a better inevitability, and it still hangs in short rounds. It is really good with. It's just after playing that deck for a while, it's just when you understand how to play it, it just seems way better than.
Yeah, I don't. Again, I think I'm gonna take the opposite viewpoint. I think Axman, like you said, can definitely win against, just a weather clear or just removal. But I think that it can do that only if the person, playing that weather clear or removal does it kind of badly. I think if you're a good player and you have say only a couple removal options against them, and you're still getting hit by the weather, I think if you play that out in the right way, pretty smartly, you can just beat Axman with just that removal. You just kind of save it for the very last moment, maybe bait them into a pass and then catch up real quick. And I think a big reason why, to answer Joe's question, why the Alchemy or the Axman maybe weren't so popular is a lot of these decks do have the removal option. Like Henselt runs Scorch, Machines, Alchemy has removal, even like Deathwish, Dagon, you can just throw things at the Axman with Cyclops, and Mandrake's super popular. But again, a lot of these decks too also have the access to the weather clear in the form of Runestones or Black Blood or something. So I think that it becomes a little bit worse because a lot of these decks do have the removal, and then you can get high roll just out of the game, and it makes it a little bit risky. But I would agree with you guys that it is super strong. I just maybe not go as far as say it's best in the game.
Well, the thing is, you have access to 4 very, very, very strong weather effects, and they have, on average, access to 33% of a weather clear, kind of so. The math is just heavily in your favor that they're just not going to be able to deal with one of your weathers, and let alone all. So, I've just I've not encountered problems with matchups like Alchemy or whatever, and yeah, sometimes that they have all of the dudes and they high roll a weather clear and I drew bad and only weather whatever, but that's so unlikely. It's just not how that matchup plays on average. Just it's the only deck that just has game against everything that I've found.
I think it's also one of the most skill-intensive decks, not only when you're
Correct.
playing it, but also playing against it. I think the individual player skill in any matchup involving Axman, be it the player and the opponent, I think it really, really matters much more often than in other games. You get a much more tangible edge there. In my experience climbing to Grandmaster this season, I happen to have a very, very good win rate against Axman. But as you were talking about a little bit before the show, most of those games, there were a lot of like, oh shit moments. Like, well, if my opponent does this, picks up on the fact that my hand is configured in this way because of a tell I gave away, something like that, I'm in very real trouble and in danger of losing here. And I think that piloted by an expert, the Axman deck is certainly one of the harder decks to beat in the game, if not, top of the hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my experience playing Axman, it's pretty hard because like I think that's a deck where you really wish you could like hand pick your opening hand, because often I'll just find like maybe I'm like one or two Axman short, or like maybe one Weather short. You know what I mean? And it's very hard to. I think honestly the mulligan is really hard in that deck. Finding enough of a balance, enough Axman, not too many, not too little, enough weather, enough like damage sources. It can get pretty tricky, I think, and it does take a lot of skill to pilot that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring out there. It's I wouldn't call it a combo deck or anything, but your deck is basically comprised of two different types of pieces, and you're looking for, a bunch of X and a bunch of Y. You don't want too much of X because then your Y is not great. You don't want too much of Y because then your X is worth a lot less. So you are trying to hit this balance. So there is, I wouldn't call it a fail rate, like I would say something like not drawing Neckers in your consume deck, but there definitely can be a lot of variability, variance rather, within the hands you draw.
There's a lot of planning you have to do when you play Axman about the texture of the game during mulligans. So, for example, if you have like 2 or 3 weather, you have to determine whether or not you're actually going to use the second and the third weather, like how relevant those are, what is the likelihood of a clear, and all that stuff. Like there'll frequently be spots that you go into round 2 or round 3 with multiple weathers in hand, and if like you keeping one, trying to play around a clear they probably don't have, leaves a dead card in your hand, and you lose the game because there's like so many things you have to think of like a million years in advance with Axman in order to play that deck optimally. But when you do play optimally, dumpsters everything.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say that's pretty fair. Yeah, so I think we covered pretty much all the open, unless there's anything I forgot about that you guys want to bring up.
I think I covered most of the stuff I wanted to. If Truedawn doesn't have anything, maybe we'll take some chat questions.
Well, we do have 2 other news topics that I did want to cover before we move on to that. Now,
sweet.
There
what
was a big developer Ask Me Anything on the official forums, and while we didn't get too much in the way of leaks, we did get 2 little nuggets of information that I think are really, really interesting. Now, the first one is something that people have been clamoring for a while. Well, I guess actually both of these are something people have been clamoring for a while. But they did mention a proposed coin flip fix that is being tested currently. Now, it's something completely different, I think, than people have been asking for or been expecting. The way that this proposed solution is working is that each leader in the game has a initiative value, say. And now your initiative value depends on whether you would go first or second in a very binary way, right? So let's say, you have one leader with an initiative value of 3. He's always going to go second when he's matched up against a leader with an initiative value of 2 or 1. And he's always going to go first when he's matched up against a leader with a higher initiative value, 4, 5, 6, etc. And when he's matched up in a mirror or with a leader with the same initiative value, you'd go back to the coin flip. Now, this is something that is pretty unique. I mean, what do you guys think of it? It's something not many people were expecting, I'd say. I think that's fair.
It's an interesting solution to the problem. I kind of like how it kind of restores the level of identity archetypes. It also makes it so leaders that are more synergy oriented can have a place in the game. So, for example, like obviously the leaders like Henselt or Brouver, or the raw power leaders, would have a very low initiative, and more synergistic ones like well, not synergistic, but like things like Philavendra. Like Philavendra would probably have the highest initiative in the game because that card sucks. But like being able to go along that scale of deciding like, okay, this is like not super raw powerful. It sets up things for later, so we can make it so they're going to go first a higher percentage of the time. Like the specifics of this matter and the specifics of this are very important, but I think that it is a solid framework to build from, whereas we currently do not have that right now. So I'm interested to see some like prototypes of things and see what direction they're considering taking it in. It definitely seems like a reasonable way to go about this if executed correctly.
So, first of all, I'm super happy and very surprised that they're at least trying to address the issue. In my opinion, I've, gone on record as saying before that I didn't think they were going to address it anytime soon, particularly since they do the red blue for the CDPR licensed tournaments. That being said, I also want to say exactly what Truedawn said. The specifics are huge here. Everything is basically just speculation, and I could see this working out well in some ways and working out not so well in other ways. While I agree with most of the pros that he talked about, I guess I'll bring up the other side of the argument is the cons. Do we really want to live in a world where Dagon always goes first against, against Henselt? Like, doesn't that take a lot of the variance out of the game? And, if you're playing this leader against that leader, it will go that way 100% of the time. I'm not so sure I like that aspect of it, unless, of course, they start designing cards that are like, let's say, a 10 strength silver that raises your initiative by 3. Things like that. So you play like an underpowered card to get some initiative points. I have no idea if that's anything they're thinking about working, but it seems like a very logical place to go. So basically, I think there's upsides, downsides. I'm happy they're working on it in general, and I need more details to really formulate a strong opinion.
Yeah, your concerns about games being samey is definitely justified. Like that is certainly a danger to this system. But I think if you could potentially couple this system with more dynamic cards with like modal abilities, like if you kind of like design the rest of the game the way I want to design it and then do the initiative thing, I think you'd be in a pretty good spot where you have like all of these dynamic synergy based cards that play differently in different spots, but the coin flip like is kind of settled. That's like you're in like closer to correct territory. Like you're kind of in the ballpark. So I think that this is it's a reasonable thing to think about. I like that they're thinking about it, like you said. It shows like creativity and desire to fix a very core problem of the game. It's like kind of a really late by a lot, but better late than never. So that's like it's cool that they're working. I think that's great.
What do you think, Shu? You haven't said much on it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think everyone's obviously happy that they're at least trying something, right? Like, no one's expecting them to find the perfect solution right away, but people are happy that something is at least being done because, like, I think, like Joe, a lot of people kind of maybe lost hope over the past year about this getting fixed. I do have two concerns about it. I think one concern is that they're not exactly fixing the coin flip per se, right? They're just kind of bouncing around it, which is fine, but it's going to be super, super hard for them to balance around, right? Like, just taking the track record of, like, different, updates like Midwinter and things like that, and, like, when they have these big updates where a lot of cards changes, like, things get unbalanced. Like, it's no surprise, It's, you change a lot of cards, like, you're going to miss some stuff. And now you throw this extra initiative thing in there, and it's going to be even harder to balance, this specifically. And a big problem is that this initiative is tied to deck. Not even to decks, to leaders. It's tied to leaders, so for example, you have a leader where maybe you have several different archetypes, right? How are you going to balance all those with one initiative stat on one of the leaders? Like, it's going to get very hairy, and while I think if they do it right, it'll be really good for the game, I'm very skeptical that they're going to be able to get it right anytime soon, just because it's such a hard task. Not that I think the devs are bad or anything, but I think even the best devs would struggle with balancing this correctly.
Yeah, it's about giving yourself a foundation to build from, which they didn't have for like midwinter patches, which is why those were disasters.
Right.
They were kind of just doing it from the seat of their pants and didn't have any foundation to work from. If they fix that, then this becomes easier. If they have like a core idea that they're going, they know what the foundation is supposed to be. That makes that process much easier. Though you are like right in the fact that there are a lot of things to consider, and balancing it would be hard. And again, we're still not dealing with the problem of when you go first, you're inherently advantage, or go second, you're inherently more advantage than going first. So even though like you'll have ostensibly less powerful decks going second more often, and it may make the win rates like across the board look more reasonable. That still doesn't deal with like the gameplay problems of, okay, I'm on the blue coin, I'm a huge dog to win, and I can't really do anything. That's why I would advocate for more things that allow you to flip the coin within game, like more things like, not like spies, like kind of at all. Just in the only similarity to spies would be that they allow you to gain card advantage, but you just have a bunch of those, and then they like it makes it less binary. Where it's like, I have my spy, do you have your spy? Okay, no, it doesn't matter. If you have a bunch of those effects, it makes it so like, okay, like, well, I'll do this and you do this, and like I ended up having like this percentage of things go my way and you had this percentage of things, and then like it's not like rigid, so it would make it so you actually do things in game to fight over the coin, and that's the way it should be, so the gameplay actually changes instead of just the win rate numbers. Like this suggested change is probably like reasonable for the win rate number, but the gameplay doesn't change, and the gameplay is what's frustrating. I'm in the blue coin, I'm gonna lose. That's it.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. Like,
Yeah.
make it so you can have unlimited spies. I mean, that way certain decks can pick how many
Yeah.
spies they want, you know, and it becomes
Well,
like a choice. I mean, obviously that's ridiculous, but I
wouldn't-
get what you're saying.
It wouldn't be spies. It would be like, so like you could have like Siri and carryover and like spies that only work when you're still ahead after they're played, and then like something else. Like, if you sure should be like 10 plus ways to gain card advantage off different situations. And then you
Playable
could-
Fists,
Yeah,
old
yeah.
school Kieran, different ways
like
to
all,
to do
just
this.
like just make it so there's a bunch of ways to do it, so no singular way becomes incredibly like powerful, and then you could build your deck in certain ways to like leverage whatever way you want, and like it makes deck building matter, it makes gameplay matter, you're doing things. So yeah, you just have to change the gameplay. The gameplay is the problem. Like, just getting into a game, seeing the blue coin, and being like, okay, I can't do anything. Like, that's bad. You don't want that. You don't want that in your game. So you need to try and endeavor to make that different, not necessarily just make it so, okay, the win rate's 50-50 on either side. No.
You could even do it like kind of before the game starts. Like, if your deck has 30 or more cards, your leader gets +2 initiative, so he's more likely to go second. You know, you could have a card in the game that's like maybe 10 points, you know, always in your starting hand, you can't mulligan it. You know, if you have this card in your deck, then you get +2 initiative or something like that. Different ways where you can kind of, the player can kind of, you know, directly pull those levers and decide when they want to go first or second and how badly they want it, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right that if they did this, I would be much happier personally if there were other ways to affect initiative besides just the leader. That would solve like one of my main concerns. And another thing I did want to point out about this, you and Truedawn both expressed concerns that yeah, it's incredibly difficult to balance. And you're right. This is changing. It's another huge change for the game if it winds up going through. It's a lot of moving pieces all at once, and it is very, very difficult to balance perfectly, particularly on your first try. It's just not happening. But I will counter that with, in a perfect world with absolutely perfect balance, hypothetically, you can do much more with this because it's just giving another knob to turn. So now it's not just strength and ability on the various leaders. Like when they gave leaders, you know, strength and put them on the board, that was another knob to turn as far as balancing the different leaders. Now you also have initiative. So if done properly, you can just sort of get things to an even closer state balance wise, which is interesting.
No, that's definitely a good point. Like, I'm a little bit dubious on initiative as the end all be all, this is fixed solution, but initiative as part of several changes. Like, I think that's reasonable.
It's
like,
a great step, yeah.
Yeah. So if it's just the whole plan, little sketchy on that. But if it's part of other things, like working in conjunction with other changes, then I'm more amenable to it.
I'd agree with that. Okay, and the next little nugget of information that we've received from this developer, Ask Me Anything, again, something that people have been wanting for a little while now, is they did touch on the create mechanic and what their plans are with that. Now, we have heard them say that some create cards are looking at being reworked, notably like the Elven Scout, the Slave Drivers, and also the possibility of these create mechanics being taken out of any competitive game mode, so ranked or pro ladder, and only being something that's an arena or casual type of card. Now, what do you guys think about this, and what would you guys like to see them do with Create quickly, since I think we've beaten this to death on many a
Yes, yes,
show?
yes, 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 yes. All for all of this. One of the most egregious things I saw while watching the most recent Open was the fact that Black Blood is a completely playable top tier caliber tournament card. This is insane to me. Like, it just should not be that way, right? Like, what? We're playing a silver with just like a wild, random, could be anything, impossible to play around because it could interact with the graveyard or it could effectively lacerate your row with the 5 strength guy into Blood Moon or whatever. Like, these are not the type of cards you want at the top level of competitive play. And please, just for the love of God, get rid of Slave Driver and Elven Scout. Just, they're both so egregious on power level, scale, everything. They're fine in the arena. Cool. Send them into the arena where bronzes don't matter anyway, and they're all just nonsense. Send them over there. Get rid of them. I never want to see them again. I can't wait for this to hopefully happen.
Yeah, so Create was initially a response to games of Gwent not being particularly different. We were running into a spot where games were pretty samey. There were not a lot of dynamic cards, and they wanted to try and fix that. And they kind of took the heavy-handed approach of, we'll make explicit variants a thing. Obviously, that was not received particularly well. Although it is worth noting that when you remove Create, we are very likely going to wind up in the same spot again, where games are all samey and play very similarly every time. So you would need to supplement that with dynamic, like modal cards, more dynamic cards, stuff that isn't always the same. But
Monster Nest.
Yeah, stuff like things that change, but not change on RNG, change on player decision or change on board state or etc. Like things that change based upon decisions players have made, and that's like kind of the route that they should go. But you do need to like couple that with this. If you just strip Create, the games are going to be all the same thing, and it's like even more so than they are now. They're already pretty samey. Like they're already pretty like set in stone. So you do need to like couple this with like changes, and they did say they're changing a lot of the Create cards, hopefully to modal spells, because that would make sense. Both keeping in the original flavor of the card and making it so they have more dynamic cards. So yeah, Create was not great. There were a lot of toxic elements of it. Gwent is balanced in such a way where cards like golds and silvers are supposed to only be played once, and Create made that not a thing. There's also a lot of silver cards that are really important to react to certain strategies, and if you high rolled one of them, you were heavily favored because you rolled the dice good, like Weather Clear off of Runestone, for example. Peter off of Runestone when you're playing against Consume, etc. All that stuff. Like the swing is just way too big for just no cost. So I'm definitely here for Create not being a thing in competitive play, but they do need to replace it with more dynamic cards, or the games are going to be boring.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad they're looking at Create again, something people wanted for a while. I'm not going to shed a tear really about, like Elven Scout or Slave Driver, even dumb stuff like Aguara being, maybe taken out of the game or changed. I'm on board with you guys where I think Spawn is maybe the way to do that, where you get kind of different options on a card. People make the argument, well, Kalak, you only pull emissaries. Well, it's really more of a balance issue than I think a design issue of that card. If Assassin was better, then you'd probably want to play it more.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And
even stuff like Glorious Hunt, I mean, you can do it that way, where a card changes depending on, like Truedawn said, the board state. If you're winning, you get this effect. If you're losing, you get that. And again, people say, well, no one plays Glorious Hunt. Well, it's a 13-point silver. That it's more of a balance power level thing than design. One thing I did want to mention is that I wouldn't want to see every single Create card gone from the game, right? I mean, there's a
Triss
way.
Is great.
Yeah, exactly. There's a way where you can make Create cards that are, fair, decent, changes the dynamic of the game, but are not, leave all the stupid stuff outside the door. You know what I mean? Like Triss, even Winch is good, despite the problems with Henselt. But that's more of a Henselt problem than Winch. So I would like to see them be very selective with this, where they keep certain Create cards that are, I think a lot of people deem healthy or okay to be in the game, and get rid of all the junk. Yeah,
the Create cards that pool are derived from player choice are fine. So Triss's pool is derived from player choice. Elven Scout's pool is derived from player choice. So, like, even though that's just like a free roll point in a bronze, like design-wise, that card's close to okay, because the pool is based on player decision. So whenever you have create cards where I'm going to build my deck in such a way that makes the create pool do this, that's fine. Like, that's actually pretty cool stuff. It creates a modal card that isn't set in stone that you can modulate yourself based upon what you're trying to do. I like stuff like that. So Triss is like the perfect example of it. So if you ever want to like maintain those cards or make more of those cards, do that. The problem with create is just it's completely random and the high roll absurd. If you just make it so people have agency over that, it removes all those problems. Like, you don't have RNG as much. You just have your own decision about the kind of things you want to.
Yeah, create. I mean, it has a few things. One, you have to make the pool very narrow. You know, that's why Winch is okay. You're pulling out of maybe 10 machines, and Elven Scout isn't, because you're pulling out of what, like 30 bronze cards in Sky Tall that are not in your deck.
Well, it depends on how you build your deck. That's the thing. Like,
yeah,
it's cool.
It's pretty insane. And then also too, the choices that you're getting from create all have to do like similar things. You know what I mean? Where the machines, you kind of know what you're gonna get when you pull a machine for the most part. They all do different things, but they're all about 10 to 12 strength depending on the board state. Whereas with, you know, Slave Driver, you get something insane. Elven Scout, you get like a Weather Clear right when you need it. That's giving you like 20 value. Like, it's got to be very similar power level. So, you know, I think I like this change. Again, you just kind of can balance it more, you know, without maybe going so far to the extreme where you're just removing all create out of the game.
Yeah, and I actually think that the thing with Winch, I do think Winch is fine and Henselt is fine. This is gonna be my hot take for the day. Henselt is actually totally fine, but the problem is that he's the only leader with a ceiling commiserate to his cost, so he seems overpowered. So what I mean by that is when you set up Henselt with, like, you play a bunch of machines and you Naneki them back and then you get a machine to stick and then you Henselt, it's really strong, but you had to go through like a fair amount of work to do that. You could argue it's not enough work, but you had to like do a bunch of stuff. And it's one of the few leaders where you actually have to like do a bunch of things and then I get this huge payoff on the back end. There aren't really any other cards that function that way, so Henselt's ceiling being as big as it is seems busted, when in reality you could just make other cards like that. And you kind of should make other cards like that because Henselt feels awesome. Like, you did all this work and you get to, like, all these machines come down. It's super sweet. And it's one of the few cool things left in the game. So I think Henselt is actually totally fine as long as you make other cards like Henselt.
It's a really good point, actually. I had never considered it like that, that there's like this work you have to put into Henselt. But you're right. I mean, you don't get a 3-card pull with Henselt without playing a winch, finding the machine you want, getting it to stick, you know?
Yeah. Like, you can totally make the argument it's not enough work,
right?
But it's like relative to what you're getting, but it's work.
Yeah, like the Neneki situation you talk about, I'm in complete agreement with you there. What I would say is probably, if there's a problem with it, the problematic element of it is just free rolling the first winch, you hit your target, and then your Henselt just gets super powered basically off of very little work, because winch is a card your deck actively wants anyway, basically. So there's not a lot of work involved in playing winch and then targeting it with Henselt. And B, one of the interesting, I think this is actually interesting, but it also greatly increases the power level of Henselt. There's no one Henselt deck list that's, you know, by far and away better than all the others right now. There's a lot of variances between them. And since there are variances in the Henselt list, they're running different machine packages, which makes it incredibly tricky to figure out, oh, so this Henselt player pulled one of the 4 playable machines, basically, off of his winch. Which deck is this? Do I have to care about that machine? Do I not care about that machine? Is that going to be a Henselt target? Is it not? Should I waste my valuable single target removal on it? Should I not? It makes these decisions very, very complex. And I've noticed the fact that since the lists have sort of deviated from each other, particularly like on my grind on rank this season, the Henselt decks as a whole got a lot more difficult to play against, because I'm not exactly sure how to use my few resources that are able to remove these super valuable targets, because I don't know whether they're important or not.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. Like, that dynamic of it is problematic, and also the raw power level. You could debate how you, like, based on how you want two things, is problematic. But I do think that just that gameplay pattern of, if I want to like just get 2 machines, I have to get this machine to stick, and then I get 2, and that's like fine. Or if I want to like go the distance, I have to go through all this to do that, and then I get a payoff. Like, you should be able to just like do that cool thing where you get all your machines in your deck and like pull 5 battering rams or whatever.
It is really cool when you see 5 rams come down,
it's
right? Like, that's an awesome feeling.
Yeah, it's an awesome thing, and the game needs awesome that. And there's ways to make it so, like, maybe you restrict the pool that he's able to pull so that people have a better idea of the combo piece so they can disrupt it better, make the cards less powerful. Like, there's a bunch of ways you can do this while still maintaining that gameplay pattern and the reward of there's a million machines coming into play. Like, just maintaining that feel-good moment. So yeah, I think that Henselt is like a lot closer to okay than people think. It actually is like reasonably healthy gameplay if balanced correctly.
Yeah. One last point. We will open up for some quick viewer questions after this, so go ahead and start putting those in the chat if you would like us to answer. But yeah, I think I agree with you. One thing about Henselt 2 is you can play around it, so it creates interesting dynamics in the game. And not only that, but you have to, as the Henselt player, be aware of what you're trying to pull, right? So it affects your mulligans. You know, if I see, 2 battering rams in my hand and I've got some done banners, maybe, like, I gotta kind of navigate my mulligans a little better. So yeah, it is kind of definitely an interesting dynamic leader. How would you maybe go ahead and balance it, Truedawn? I mean, would you take the crewman off of it? Would you give it -2 points? Would you touch the machines?
There's a million things you can do numbers wise. You could machines, you can Henselt, you can. There's like whatever you want to do numbers. That's a problem for some people to figure out, but you can totally do it. Like, it's not super difficult to get that card where you want it to be. It just the question is, where do you like want it to be? There's this current dynamic in Gwent where, because no card asks you to assume any cost, every card has the same ceiling. So because Henselt has a higher ceiling, it's seen as egregious, when Henselt actually does ask you to like do a thing first, even if that thing is easy. So they need to get to a spot where they're okay giving cards a high ceiling, as long as they're asking for you to do something up front, and decide what an okay number for those cards is, and then decide what an okay number is. So when they figure out all those numbers, then you'll be good. But you have to like be okay with a card being like 30 or 40 points situationally, like if they did the work to do that. And thus far they have seen cards like that as problematic instead of like cool puzzles that are like the payoff, or like maybe we should just tone the numbers a bit, etc. Like, they've completely eradicated the gameplay. I think the gameplay pattern's worth preserving, and you can make the power level reasonable to make it so you still get to all the feel good.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's completely fair. We've seen that again in the past with things like Cambi and stuff, where, instead of balancing it, they said, let's just axe it. And it's kind of similar again, where you got to work for that big payoff where you wipe the whole board.
Yeah, Cambi's a hard one because a board sweeper is just wild busted in this game.
Yeah, because the payoff is the game ends.
Yes. So it's like, Cambi's a weird one. That's why I want Cambi to be redesigned, where he's essentially just Exodia if you have every Skellige clan.
I mean, old Cambi especially was, you did have to do work to it. You had to, first of all, Cambi won you one round, You had to get another round win, and you had to maintain your gold. You had to get some card advantage to do it. Like, you also had to maybe bait out removal from them, deshackles, locking, and things like that. So I wouldn't say Cambi was necessarily easy, but you guys are right. It did create some problems with balancing. But anyway, in the interest of time, we will hop over to some viewer questions real quick. We've got Eric, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, with a pretty interesting one. Do you think they should keep Outlaw and Hime, or do you think they need to be reworked? So I'm guessing he's talking about cards with, like, Let the Kingslayer as well, where you kind of have the option of an ability, but you have create as kind of a backup. I mean, what do you guys think about that?
It's interesting because you do want, like, Hime is well designed in that you run it intentionally to pull things from your deck, but you don't necessarily want it to be dead. Like, you kind of just don't want players to have dead cards if you can help it, unless they're being exceptionally good. So the Discover a Silver thing is the fail-safe, so he's not ever a stone dead card. That mode is sometimes problematic because of silvers it can pull, like in the Skellige Mirror, hitting Sugrifa is nonsense. Maybe you want to have it pull from like some normal Skellige bronzes, or like some cursed like have a pool of like cursed silvers or something, or cursed bronzes or whatever, you still want to maintain that dynamic where it has the core purpose of tutoring for cursed units, and then something that makes it not dead. What you want that something that makes it not dead to be could still be the create. I think that Hime's example is like, now that spies aren't creatable, like fine. I think that that's like close to okay. Or you could do something else, but I still think it needs to maintain like core dynamic. Same with the other cards that function similarly.
Yeah, Hime is a particularly interesting case because, I mean, I feel like what you were talking about with Isengrim, right? Like the create is sort of the backup mode on it, so it's not dead. With Hime, I'm not sure that's the case. The large majority of the time I see this card played, well, it's either abusing a spy, which I just think shouldn't be there either because, into Skjal, into spy, whatever. But if it's not abusing a spy in some way, it's really going for that other mode. And like you said, the Skellige mirror, that Hime is just the best card by such a wide margin. It's crazy.
Yeah.
If you can hit, their Skjal is oftentimes awesome, or their Sigdrifa, it's the nuts. That mode just feels like it generates a lot of points, and it would be much less of a problem if there was no internet and no net decking and people were running around with all these cool unique decks, right? But when it's effectively a tutor card from your opponent's deck in any given matchup, I actually don't know how I feel about it. It's weird. There's definitely pros and cons. I was actually thinking about asking you guys this before when we were doing our own section on create, where you felt on Hime. I think he's probably the most interesting case, and I like how you said it's probably close to okay. I think that's how I feel as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty lukewarm on it. I don't have strong feelings about him or losing his create thing.
I think if they're gonna retain the create effect on Hime, because I don't think the create effect is necessarily that bad. It's a pretty narrow pool that you're choosing from. I just think that the reason that Hime is kind of problematic is that, one, you have a super powerful ability on it, where you're tutoring a curse card from your deck, which can do a lot of insane things, like Joe said, spy abuse, pull out Skjal for tempo, things like that. And then you're also giving it this backup of a create effect, which is pretty good. I mean, you're just taking a card and making it like way too strong in the front that it's never dead. When it's good to have some cards where like they're good in certain situations and bad in others. Like just like Truedawn was talking about, kind of this ceiling and floor and how you balance there.
Yeah.
So you take him, which is a pretty powerful card, and it's got a high ceiling with the spy abuse stuff, and then you raise its floor way up because now you have a backup option, which is always pretty good, right? Like you're gonna get some good stuff. Same thing with Isengrim, where you have this crazy ability pulling a spell, and if you're out of spells, well, you still get a good backup option.
Yeah, like Hime is interesting because he's dynamic in a way that's not explicitly RNG related. Like sometimes you're able to do the thing where like your deck lines up in such a way where you can actually go Hime and just call into Udalrip. And yeah, that's busted, but it's a unique thing. And then like other games, you'll just get like a Berserker, or you get Udalrip by itself, or just a Berserker Marauder, or like Skull and the Berserker Marauder, or like it'll be dead, and then you'll decide that it's better for you to do the create a silver mode. Like that card is so many different things in so many different situations. I kind of want to keep it as is, just because there are so few cards that are dynamic like that based upon player choice and not explicit RNG. So I'm pretty okay with it. But
you
again,
just got to make its abilities less powerful. I think either it's less powerful or the tutoring less powerful.
That's like debatable. I think that there's like a cost and benefit, right? So in the Skellige mirror, hitting Sigdrifa is very powerful, but there's several matchups where you're hitting like some lukewarm stuff, where like if they have like a bunch of spells, or like Squirtle, for example, they have a bunch of dead dwarf, like they're like in Hittori and all that. So you're paying a cost in another matchup. Yeah, like you're paying a cost in another matchup for it to be better in this matchup. Like there's give and take, so it's like it's closer to okay, even though the ceiling's high in one matchup. That's why I'm pretty okay with it. I don't think it's egregious. That said, if you kind of distill the good elements of Hime, like what it's like in the best cases, and you just want to make those explicit modes on it, then that's a path you could take if you want to. I'm just not sure what those are. So I think it's like close.
Yeah. Like I said, the create I think is okay, because you do get good options in certain matchups, and it depends a lot on that, and you have to know what's in your opponent's deck and when to play it. But I think coupled with the powerful ability that it already has, like no one's putting Hime in their deck for the creatability, right? They're putting it to tutor out that skill into Udalric or skill
Not
into
anymore.
Bearmaster. You know what I mean? So the fact that it's just to create, I'm fine with. You know, the creatability, I think it's okay. But when you're coupled it with another ability, then it just becomes like a really, really strong card.
If you want to take the position that tutoring for things is so powerful that there should be a cost to that, and the card should be backup mode, like tutoring is so powerful it should be dead some percentage of. If you want to take that position, I think that like that's close to reasonable. I'm just generally not a fan of making it so your players ever have dead cards, even if it means making something a little bit more powerful than it should be, because it's just not fun to have dead cards.
Yeah. I think I am in that position that tutoring is really strong in Gwent. I mean, all the best cards in the game are tutor cards. Yeah. So I think if you're going to run a tutor card, you have to assume that some of the time it's going to be dead. So again, it's like that choice where, you know, you're taking this very powerful upside, but you're also kind of balancing that with, okay, sometimes you're going to miss out on that upside and it's going to be really, really bad. And it creates interesting choices like when to play this card, you know, what to mulligan, how to build your deck to minimize the amount of times this card's dead but not go too overboard with it, you know. So I think if you are having tutor cards in the game, they need to be balanced in the sense that they shouldn't have a backup. Like, you're all in on this card, almost.
I think it's fair that they should have a cost. I'm just not sure if I want that cost to be their dead sometimes. There's
that's
like
fair.
probably another way to go about that.
Yeah, that's fair too. I'd be fine with that.
Yeah.
There was one other question that I saw in chat that was actually something we had talked about a little bit before the show, so I'd like to address. That was Hellsmoke77 in the chat saying, what do you guys think about the hand buff decks dropping 20 to 30 point bronzes? Akvastek, Nilfgaard, hand buffs seem to be pretty busted. And this is something I have some pretty strong feelings on. On my the final day, I was trying to get Grandmaster. I played against a Nilfgaard reveal deck that went 3 cards down in round 1 to effectively Mandrake, a Seer, and then Vesemir Mandrake, his guy. And even though he was 3 cards down in round 1, I just got the floor mopped with me. And it was like a pretty terrible feeling. I think that these kind of decks are bad for the game in general. And Truedawn was talking about how they sort of get to slide because they're different and they're unique. But I don't think that they're healthy. And I really, really agree with that sentiment. And it's mostly because there's no way to interact with the other player's hand. We have basically Venedal Elite. That's like it. So sure, if you're playing Nilfgaard and you have Venedal Elite, yeah, you get your free wins, you laugh to the bank. But there's no way to really interact with that zone at all. So once they get their little trick done, I mean, that's it. It's another one of these decks similar to Consume almost, in that you could just play the deck with a piece of paper over your opponent's side of the board, and it just doesn't matter what they do. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to make my big guy, and then I'm just going to drop a bunch of 25 or 30 point bronzes. And me in particular, I'm very much against these type of decks, even if their power level isn't super high. Like, we're not seeing them brought to opens and challengers and stuff. I just don't like them at all because there's no real way to deal with them.
Yeah, it's decks like this and Mill were like oddball decks that didn't actually create compelling gameplay. Like Mill, for example, nothing anyone couldn't. And similarly with this deck, either their draw is bad or it isn't. They just like, you can't interact with the hand, and you shouldn't be able to. Like, Hearthstone has learned this. Like, you don't want to have hand interaction; it becomes very, very problematic. Shout out to Dirty Rat. But whenever you are making an interesting thing, or like whenever an interesting thing pops up, and you want to assess whether or not this is worth preserving, you have to assess what the game. So what do games look like when this deck gets to do its thing, or like what is the average case for this? And the average case for that deck is they put the thing in their hand and they play wildly above rate bronzes and no one. And like that's obviously not fun because the other player has no agency over what's going on. You can't even like remove the thing they're trying to buff because they can buff whatever. Like, they don't have to buff a Sire, they can buff the no. So the fact that the only thing this deck loses to is its own inconsistency and like player decisions never matter is really toxic. And even though the deck may or may not be like good, like on a win rate basis, that doesn't matter. You shouldn't abide a deck that's toxic because it's bad. Like, people still have to play against that deck. They still get frustrated. Like, it's the same reason why we should probably still change Imlerith. Even though Imlerith decks aren't played a lot anymore because people are running Mandrake, that's still a super toxic play pattern where they play Imlerith, they buff it, and you lose. Like, that's not a fun thing. You shouldn't have that in the game. People are going to play against that and stop playing because it sucks. And it's the same thing with the hand buff. So you just, like, whenever there's a deck that is fostering gameplay like that, you kind of need to stamp it. Even, like, it's not, I guess it's like, it's not interesting, it's just different. And you have to be able to distinguish between those two things.
Preach it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the binary nature of certain decks, you know, like carryover dwarves, consume these Immerith decks, you know, like Fringilla Gambit back when that was a thing. The binary nature of these decks and kind of the game itself is a big problem that I think the game has struggled with really time and time again. It's just these things where, you know, all right, I'm up against this deck. Like, I don't run Scorch in my deck. I don't run Mandrake. I don't run this. Like, I lose. That's pretty much it, right? I have no way to counter this deck. That is definitely a huge problem and something you have to balance. That being said, I do like the fact that these decks are different, right? I mean, if you look at kind of the widespread range of Gwent decks, like, they're all pretty samey, you know? You're putting points on the board, you're playing for tempo, you're playing for value. There's very few decks that kind of, you know, give up card advantage maybe to get an advantage later in the game. There's very few decks that are combo oriented where you're trying to assemble a combo to win the game. So I would like to see more of that in the game, and for that reason I like these type of decks. But again, it's very hard to do that in Gwent without becoming extremely binary, and that's a super hard design thing that they're gonna have to figure out, I think.
Yeah. I mean, like, the important thing for combo decks to be healthy is they have to happen on board, and they cannot centralize around one card. So, like, Consume runs afoul of because it's just all about Necker, and it makes so can you answer this card? Nothing else matters. Like, that's why that deck is not great. It's like okay-ish because its power level isn't high, but that deck's not super okay. An example of this would be like my baby that I really want to see happen at some point because I can't believe this isn't in the game yet. So say for example, there's a combo deck that Combi's text is when you play this card, you control a Skellige unit from every faction, wipe the board, and you get a Hem. Or like just win the game. Whatever you want to like be. It's something close to win. Imagine like how cool that game is where you're like trying to get this board of like all the Skellige units and you're like doing stuff and your opponent's interacting with you and you like res a unit and you try to protect it with Armor Smith and like there's all this gameplay going on and you're still like doing combo stuff, but it's stuff that's like conventionally interactable. It's healthy. Like when you do it, it feels awesome. But your opponent's never like, well, I can't do anything about this, or like, oh, only this card matters. Like you want stuff like that. Like maybe not explicitly that example, like that's just one idea, but things in that vein where are incentivized to put things on board, protect them, and then something happens. So you want to like have things like that instead of going to zones that you can't interact with. Like even the graveyard's okay because there are like a bunch of ways to interact with a graveyard. You could argue there should be. But even combos that take place in the graveyard are closer to okay because that zone is conventionally interactable. The hand is not a zone that can or should be interacted with conventionally.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Gwent, like, it's missing a lot of things that other cards game. Like, other cards have, like, a mana system, for example. Even, like, kind of like a hero health total where, you know, you have this combo deck and maybe you can't interact with it, but there's a clock on them where, you know, you can go face, and if you can beat them to that, then you're going to win the game. And that's, like, an interesting game dynamic that you can play and use to balance these combo decks is how long it takes to get off. But Gwent misses a lot of that, so I think Truedawn hit it right on the head. Like, these combos, they have to be interactable somehow, and in Gwent, since there's no, like, hand mechanics to interact with, they have to happen on the board or maybe in the graveyard. I think you hit the nail right on the head with that.
Yeah, just like it's people always like you kind of get salty about Gwent always removing like combo decks or like quote unquote interesting decks like Mill or the Sambuff deck or whatever. And I understand that because outside of those, the game is pretty samey. Like that's a totally reasonable complaint to levy. But I don't think that those decks are actually the solution. You just like people are just trying to cling on to something because it's like something close to resembling the thing they want. There are ways to design new decks that like revolve around interesting things without having it be as toxic as Mill or handball, like consumer. So there's ways you can go about this. It's just going to take like kind of a shift in design philosophy that they're like kind of on their way to doing. They've shown signs that they kind of get this now. So I'm optimistic that we will get there. I just hope we get there soon, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I think that's it. I don't really see too many other viewer questions, and we have been going for a while.
I think we set the record today.
Yeah, a long time. Well, lots to talk about, which is good. So yeah, we can do some shout outs now if you guys want to. Why don't you go ahead and start, Joe?
So this week, instead of shouting out where you guys can find me, you probably know I'm actually going to shout out someone else. So I want you guys to check out, if you get the chance, a streamer by the name of Mark Theus. I just did his podcast recently, 98.3 The Legion podcast. Himself and Watchflake were gracious enough to have me on as a guest. And it's not, super in-depth analytical. We talk some Gwent, we shoot the shit. It's a lot of fun and that type of deal. I had a blast recording it, so you guys can definitely check that out on either his YouTube or his Twitch VODs. The video should be up within the next day or so. And also for my Twitter shout out, you guys should probably be following the Wild Hunt Twitter. Myself and several others have been doing a lot of behind the scenes work, and while I can't come forward with any real details for you guys yet, what I will say is think bigger, think better. It's going to be huge. So make sure to follow the Wild Hunt.
Cool. I am Frank Moon, go by Truedawn. Truedawn at TruedawnFM on Twitter, and Twitch TV/TruedawnFM on Twitch. Stream every weekday from 9 a.m. Eastern until whenever. This week we are going to be getting MTG Arena, which is going to be super awesome. If you've never played Magic before, I definitely recommend stopping by my stream on 22nd and checking it out. Until then, we will likely be playing some mixture of Eternal and Gwent. And I will also be making some YouTube videos on the Topdeck YouTube. So look at all that stuff. And appreciate you guys tolerating my game design soapbox on here.
It's good, man. We love it. Yeah. We should also get a GMP Magic stream going. Maybe this weekend, next weekend or something. That would be pretty fun.
We could just like talk about like card games. Yeah. Just like whatever card game is relevant that week.
Yeah. Well, maybe you guys have to teach me some Magic first, but
yeah, we'll get you there. Yeah. Play for the Scarab.
Yeah.
Continue from that point.
Also, for Joe's point, don't watch Marcus' podcast because ours is way better. Kappa.
People have time in their day to watch multiple podcasts.
Yeah, do both. Yeah.
You guys need to be loyal to us. I'm telling you. For my shout out, I want to shout out to You Are Mythanor in the chat. Calling me out for being a Mill player. I was a huge fan of Mill, so guilty as charged.
It's okay. Like, now that you're getting into Magic, you might be interested in Lantern Control.
God.
We should expose you to Lantern Control.
Please do. I'm ready.
It is.
I love
it is for
Mill.
Right psychopaths. If you enjoyed Mill, you should be right at home.
Oh, man. But besides that, I mean, follow me, twitch.tv/ShoePlays. I'll be dabbling into Magic a little bit, trying to learn, expand the kind of wealth of knowledge with the card games. And yeah, we'll be doing some more Gwent, graduating soon, so be on the lookout for that too. But as always, yeah, thank you guys for watching. Check out the Topdeck Top Show on Thursday, every Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern, and send them our love. But until then, we will see you guys next time.